What happens when a simple request for help at 35,000 feet is met with pure, unadulterated contempt? On American Airlines Flight 212, a man's life hung in the balance, and the one person who could save him was a black woman in a simple tracksuit. She was dismissed, belittled, and ordered to sit down by an arrogant executive who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle. But that executive, Caroline Pierce, made a fatal mistake. She had no idea she wasn't just insulting a passenger. She was challenging the most powerful lawyer in the state. What unfolded next wasn't just a mid-air drama. It was the beginning of a catastrophic fall from grace, where the karma that came back was as swift and merciless as the judgment she had so easily passed on another. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If you love inspiring stories of resilience and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support helps us share these impactful stories with even more people. Now let's get into it. The air inside the Airbus, a 321, cutting a path through the stratosphere from San Francisco to New York, was a familiar blend of stale and sterile. For Keisha Sterling, it was a rare moment of anonymity. She was dressed for comfort, not for court. A simple gray Nike tracksuit, hair pulled back in a neat bun, and noise-canceling headphones that were currently silent. She was flying commercially, a deliberate choice to remain grounded despite her position. To the other passengers in the first-class cabin, she was an unremarkable figure, perhaps a student or an athlete, easily overlooked amidst the sea of bespoke suits and designer handbags. This anonymity was a luxury she cherished. Across the aisle sat Caroline Pierce, the physical embodiment of the world Keisha often navigated but rarely inhabited. Caroline was immaculate. Her blonde hair was a perfect sharp bob. Her cream-colored blazer from the row was draped just so over her shoulders. She radiated an aura of impatient authority, tapping furiously at her phone, her fingers adorned with a Cartier love bracelet and a diamond ring the size of a postage stamp. She was a senior vice president at Ethelred Capital, a notoriously aggressive private equity firm, and she was flying to JFK to close a 9-figure merger that would be the crown jewel of her career. Every second counted. About an hour into the flight, a ripple of distress disturbed the cabin's placid hum. A few rows behind Keisha, an elderly gentleman, later identified as Mr. Gregory Alastair, a distinguished retired history professor, let out a choked gasp. His face, moments before a placid pink, was rapidly turning a blotchy, alarming shade of red. He clawed at his throat, his breath coming in ragged, wheezing saws. A flight attendant, a young man named Liam with a perpetually worried expression, rushed over. "Sir? Sir, are you all right?" The man couldn't answer. His wife, a frail woman with wide, terrified eyes, cried out, "He's having a reaction. I think it was the cashews in the snack mix, his allergy. We left his EpiPen in the checked luggage. Oh God, we thought it was in his carry-on." Panic began to coil in the air. "Is there a medical professional on board?" Liam's voice cracked with strain, projecting through the cabin. "We have a medical emergency." Keisha's head snapped up. Her years as a prosecutor, and before that, her training as a medic in the Army Reserves, a part of her life few people knew about, kicked in. She saw the telltale signs immediately: urticaria, dyspnea, the beginnings of angioedema around his lips. Classic anaphylaxis. He had minutes, maybe less. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. "I can help," she said, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the rising panic. "I have medical training." As she moved toward the aisle, a perfectly manicured hand shot out, blocking her path. It was Caroline Pierce. She didn't even look up from her phone initially. "Sit down," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. Keisha paused, startled. "Excuse me." Caroline finally lifted her gaze, her eyes sweeping over Keisha's tracksuit with a look of profound disgust. "He asked for a medical professional, not someone looking for a little excitement." She sniffed a barely audible sound of contempt. "Let the flight crew handle it. They're trained for this." The sheer audacity of the statement left Keisha momentarily speechless. The man was turning blue. "Ma'am," Keisha said, keeping her voice level despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "With all due respect, he is in anaphylactic shock. He needs epinephrine immediately. I know what to do. The cabin crew's medical kit should have an auto-injector." Caroline let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Oh, you know what to do. Did you get your degree from a box of Cracker Jacks? You're a distraction." "Liam," she snapped, her voice now sharp as broken glass, turning to the flustered flight attendant. "Get this woman to sit down. She is interfering with a medical emergency and making the other passengers nervous." Liam looked torn. On one hand, a man was dying. On the other, Caroline Pierce exuded the kind of intimidating wealth and power that made airline staff instinctively compliant. He saw a woman in a designer blazer and another in a sweatsuit. His brain, under pressure, made a disastrous calculation based on pure, unadulterated bias. "Ma'am," he said, turning to Keisha, his tone pleading. "Please return to your seat. We have the situation under control. We're contacting MedLink on the ground. There is no time for that." Keisha's voice rose, a flicker of the iron authority she usually kept sheathed. "His airway is closing. By the time you get a patch through to a doctor on the ground, he could be in full cardiac arrest. I need access to your medical kit now." "Absolutely not," Caroline interjected, standing up to her full, imposing height. "You will not. You are agitating the situation and you have no authority here. You could be anyone. You could make it worse. For all we know, you're trying to get a lawsuit out of this." She turned to the other passengers who were now staring wide-eyed. "Everything is fine. The professionals are handling it." Her husband, Mark, a portly man in a golf shirt who had been silent until now, chimed in, patting his wife's arm. "Listen to her, honey. Let the crew do their jobs." The injustice was a physical blow. Keisha saw Mr. Alastair's eyes start to roll back. She saw his wife sobbing, her pleas lost in the noise. She was the only person on that plane who knew with absolute certainty that she could save his life, and she was being blocked by ignorance and arrogance. A cold fury, glacial and immense, settled in her chest. But she was a strategist. Causing a scene, getting into a physical altercation, would only waste more precious seconds and get her restrained. With a final, searing look at Caroline, a look that promised a reckoning, Keisha made a calculated decision. She slowly, deliberately, sat back down. She couldn't fight her way to the man, but she could be a witness, a very, very good witness. As she buckled her seatbelt, the captain's voice came over the intercom, terse and urgent. "Flight attendants, prepare for an emergency diversion. We are landing at the nearest suitable airport." Caroline Pierce let out an exasperated sigh, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Unbelievable," she muttered, pulling out her laptop. "My entire schedule ruined." She glanced over at Keisha, a triumphant, venomous smirk on her face. It was the smirk of someone who had won, someone who had put the hired help back in her place. It was a smirk that would come to haunt her waking nightmares. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin shifted from panic to a thick, suffocating tension. Every passenger was acutely aware of the drama that had just unfolded. Sidelong glances were thrown at Keisha, then at Caroline. Some held sympathy for Keisha, others a nervous deference to Caroline's obvious power. Most were simply scared. The wheezing from Mr. Alastair's seat had grown faint, a terrifying sign that his breathing was becoming shallower, his body failing. Liam and another flight attendant were now with the Alastairs, speaking in low, urgent tones into the in-flight phone, relaying information to the MedLink service on the ground. They had a defibrillator out, but Keisha knew it was the wrong tool for the moment. It was like bringing a hammer to fix a watch. His heart was being starved of oxygen. It wasn't an electrical problem yet, but it would be soon. Keisha remained still, a portrait of unnerving calm. Inside, however, her mind was a whirlwind. The prosecutor in her was cataloging every detail. Caroline Pierce's exact words, her husband's complicity, the flight attendant's hesitant compliance, the precise time on the cabin clock when she had offered help, and the exact moment she was refused. She noted the passengers in the surrounding seats who had a clear view of the incident. These were not just memories, They were data points for a testimony she knew, with chilling certainty, she would eventually have to give. The frustration was a bitter pill. She had sworn an oath in 2 different careers to protect and serve. First in the military, then in law. To be rendered helpless, not by circumstance but by bigotry, was a unique and infuriating form of impotence. The woman in the cream blazer hadn't just seen a passenger. She had seen a black woman in a tracksuit and made a series of assumptions that were now potentially fatal. She had dismissed Keisha's expertise, invalidated her offer of help, and asserted a dominance born of social standing and race. It was a microcosm of a battle Keisha had fought her entire life, but never on a stage so immediate and life-threatening. Caroline, for her part, seemed utterly unfazed. She had opened her laptop and was now deep into a spreadsheet, her brow furrowed in concentration. To her, the emergency was a background noise, an infuriating delay. She had already texted her team in New York. Plane diverting to Chicago. Unbelievable incompetence. Some passenger drama. Will be at least 3 hours late. Push the meeting to 5 p.m. She had solved her problem. The man dying a few feet away was no longer her concern. The captain's voice crackled over the PA again. "This is Captain Matthews. We have been cleared for an emergency landing at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. We should be on the ground in approximately 15 minutes. Paramedics will be meeting the aircraft at the gate. Please remain in your seats." 15 minutes. Keisha did the math. The human brain can suffer irreversible damage after just a few minutes of oxygen deprivation. 15 minutes was an eternity. She closed her eyes, sending a silent prayer not just for Mr. Alastair, but for the wife who was watching her husband slip away. The descent was rapid and steep. The plane banked sharply, and the city of Chicago appeared through the windows, a sprawling grid of lights against the dark plains. The landing was firm, the screech of the tires on the runway a jarring end to the surreal flight. The aircraft taxied at a speed that was unusual, clearly given priority on the tarmac, heading directly for a gate where an ambulance and several official-looking vehicles were already waiting, their lights flashing in the twilight. The moment the seatbelt sign pinged off, Caroline was on her feet, grabbing her expensive leather tote. "Finally," she muttered to her husband. "Let's get off this flying circus. I need to rebook us on the next flight out." But no one was getting off. The captain emerged from the cockpit, his face grim. He stood at the front of the cabin, his presence commanding silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated," Captain Matthews said, his voice grave. "Paramedics will be boarding the aircraft first to attend to the passenger in distress. Federal law enforcement will also be boarding, as is standard procedure for an in-flight medical diversion of this nature. No one will deplane until they have given clearance." A murmur went through the cabin. Federal law enforcement. Caroline's perfectly sculpted face tightened. This was more than just a delay. It was an official incident, a problem that could affect her. She shot another venomous glare at Keisha, as if this too were somehow her fault. The jet bridge connected with a solid thud, and the cabin door was opened. 3 paramedics in full gear charged in, their faces masks of professional urgency. They pushed past the stunned passengers and immediately began working on Mr. Alastair, their voices a calm, controlled stream of medical jargon. "No pulse, starting compressions. Push 1 of EPI. Get a line in. Let's get him intubated." Keisha watched them, her heart aching. They were doing exactly what she had wanted to do 20 minutes ago. The dose of epinephrine they were now administering might have been enough to reverse the reaction entirely if given when she first offered. Now, it was a desperate, last-ditch effort. Behind the paramedics, 2 men in dark suits boarded. They were calm, observant, and their eyes missed nothing. They radiated the quiet, unmistakable authority of federal agents. One of them spoke to the captain, who nodded and then turned his attention back to the first-class cabin. He scanned the faces, his gaze finally landing on Caroline, who was still standing, impatient and defiant. Then his eyes moved past her, locking directly onto Keisha's. His expression softened with a mixture of respect and regret. He walked down the aisle, pointedly ignoring Caroline, and stopped directly in front of Keisha's seat. "Ma'am," Captain Matthews said, his voice full of sincerity. "My flight attendant informed me that you offered assistance. He also informed me that you were discouraged from doing so. On behalf of the entire crew, I want to apologize profusely." The cabin fell dead silent. Every eye was now on Keisha. Caroline Pierce froze, her hand on her overhead bin, her face a mask of disbelief. She was being publicly, pointedly ignored. Keisha simply nodded. "I understand you were in a difficult position, Captain. But someone else wasn't content to let it be. A man in seat 3A, a tech entrepreneur from Palo Alto who had been watching the entire exchange, spoke up. He'd been pulling up news articles on his phone since the agents boarded, his brow furrowed. "Wait a minute," he said, squinting at Keisha. "I know you. I've seen you on TV. You're the Attorney General, aren't you? From California?" He held up his phone. On the screen was a news photo of Keisha Sterling at a press conference, her face stern and commanding, standing behind a podium bearing the Great Seal of the state of California. The woman in the photo was the same woman in the gray tracksuit. A collective gasp went through the cabin. It was a wave of pure shock moving from seat to seat. The man who had spoken, the other passengers, the flight attendants, all of them stared, their minds scrambling to reconcile the powerful public figure with the quiet woman who had been so contemptuously dismissed. And then, every single head turned to look at Caroline Pierce. Her face, which had been a mask of triumphant disdain, had crumpled. The color drained from it, leaving a pasty, horrified pallor. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The smug smirk was gone, replaced by the dawning, gut-wrenching terror of someone who has just realized they didn't just make a mistake. They committed career suicide in front of an audience of witnesses, 35,000 feet in the air. She had just tried to humiliate one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. The silence in the cabin was no longer tense. It was damning. The revelation hung in the air, thick and electric. Attorney General Sterling. The title itself seemed to suck the remaining oxygen out of the cabin. The woman Caroline Pierce had treated like a piece of lint on her blazer was the chief law officer for a state with an economy larger than most countries. The quiet, unassuming passenger in sweats was, in her professional life, a force of nature who commanded an army of lawyers, investigators, and agents. Caroline's blood ran cold. The spreadsheet, the merger, the entire 9-figure deal she was flying to New York to secure, it all evaporated from her mind, replaced by a single, blinding flash of panic. Her mind replayed the scene in horrifying, high-definition detail. Her dismissive words, her condescending tone, the smug satisfaction she'd felt. She had called the Attorney General a liar, questioned her credentials, and accused her of trying to orchestrate a lawsuit in front of federal agents and a plane load of witnesses. Her husband, Mark, looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. He sank back into his seat, his face ashen, finally understanding the catastrophic magnitude of his wife's arrogance. He tugged at her sleeve, a weak, desperate gesture. "Caroline," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Oh my God, Caroline." She couldn't respond. She was frozen, her designer tote bag slipping from her grasp and thudding onto the carpeted floor with a dull, final sound. The two FBI agents, Agent Miller and Agent Russo, exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance. Their job had just become both simpler and infinitely more complicated. This was no longer just about a medical diversion. It was about a potential interference case involving a high-ranking public official. Agent Miller, the senior of the two, stepped forward. His demeanor was professionally bland, giving nothing away. "Attorney General Sterling," he said, his voice respectful. "Agent Miller, FBI Chicago Field Office. We're sorry to meet under these circumstances. We'll need to get a statement from you, ma'am, but we can do that somewhere more comfortable once we deplane." Keisha gave a slight nod, her expression still unreadable. "Of course, Agent Miller. I'm happy to cooperate fully." She didn't look at Caroline. She didn't need to. The waves of horrified realization rolling off the woman were practically a physical force. The paramedics finally wheeled a gurney down the aisle. On it was Mr. Alastair, now intubated, an IV line in his arm. his chest rhythmically rising and falling with the help of an ambu bag. He was alive, but his condition was clearly critical. His wife followed, weeping silently, her hand clutching his. As she passed Keisha, she paused, her eyes locking with the Attorney General's. "Thank you," she mouthed, a look of profound, desperate gratitude on her face. "You tried." Keisha's stoic facade cracked for just a second, a flicker of deep empathy in her eyes. She reached out and gently squeezed the woman's arm. "He's in good hands now." Once the paramedics were off the plane, Agent Miller turned his attention to the rest of the cabin. "We will be deplaning row by row. You will be escorted to a private lounge where you will wait to be interviewed. Please have your identification ready." He then looked directly at Caroline, his gaze hardening almost imperceptibly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice flat and official. "Miss Caroline Pierce, you and your husband will please wait here. We need to speak with you." It wasn't a request, it was an order. The deplaning process was slow and methodical. Passenger after passenger filed past, each one stealing a look at the three central figures of the drama: the composed Attorney General, the terrified executive, and the implacable federal agent. It was a walk of shame for Caroline, each passing glance a fresh spike of humiliation. When the cabin was finally empty, Agent Russo, the younger agent, approached her. "Miss Pierce, your husband. We'll need your phones, please." "My phone?" Caroline stammered, clutching her device as if it were a life raft. "But my work. I have a major deal." "It's standard procedure," Agent Miller cut in, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We need to preserve any and all communications regarding the events on this flight. Refusal to comply will be noted." The threat was clear. With trembling hands, Caroline and Mark surrendered their phones. The devices that held the keys to her kingdom, her contacts, her emails, the details of the merger, were now evidence. They were escorted off the plane and not to the comfortable private lounge the other passengers were taken to, but to a small, windowless room deep in the airport's sterile administrative corridor. The room contained a metal table and 3 chairs. It felt like an interrogation room, because it was. For the next 2 hours, Caroline and Mark were questioned separately. The agents were polite, their questions precise. They asked her to recount the events from the moment Mr. Alistair showed signs of distress. Caroline, her lawyerly instincts kicking in too late, tried to spin the story. She painted herself as a concerned citizen, worried about a non-professional interfering and causing harm. "I was only thinking of the poor man's safety," she said, trying to sound reasonable, her voice shaky. This woman. She seemed agitated. I didn't know who she was. I felt the flight crew was the best equipped to handle it. Agent Miller listened patiently, taking notes. "So, when Miss Sterling, a trained Army medic, identified the man's condition as anaphylaxis and requested the epinephrine from the medical kit, your assessment was that she was agitated." Caroline flinched. Trained Army medic? How could she have known that? The information hit her like another physical blow. The story she was trying to build was crumbling before she could even finish it. And when you told her to sit down and accused her of looking for a lawsuit, that was also out of concern for the other passengers' safety. Agent Russo added, his tone neutral but the question sharp as a scalpel. They knew. They already had statements from the flight attendant, Liam, and probably half a dozen other passengers. They had her words, her actions, and now they were watching her squirm. The persona of the powerful, untouchable executive had shattered, leaving behind a scared, desperate woman trying to lie her way out of a hole she had dug with her own arrogance. Meanwhile, Keisha was in the airport's VIP lounge, sipping a bottle of water provided by a very apologetic airport manager. She gave her statement calmly and factually, omitting emotion and sticking to the observable truths. She described the medical symptoms she saw, the words that were exchanged, and the timeline of events. She presented as the perfect witness, credible, precise, and unimpeachable. Her own chief of staff, Damien Croft, was already on the phone with her, having been alerted to the situation. "Keisha, are you okay?" The governor's office just called. The FBI notified them of an incident involving you. The press is already getting wind of it. I'm fine, Damien, she said, her voice weary. There was an incident, a woman. Let's just say she made some poor choices. Poor choices? Damien's voice was tense. I'm looking at a tweet from a guy who says he was on the plane. He says a woman in first class stopped you from saving a man's life and that woman found out you were the AG. Is that true? Keisha sighed. Essentially, yes. A pause on the other end of the line. Oh, that woman, Damien said, his voice a mixture of anger and awe. That woman has no idea what's about to happen to her, does she? No, Keisha replied, looking out the window at the flashing lights on the tarmac. No, she doesn't. The wheels of justice, she knew, were often slow, but sometimes karma didn't wait. It hitched a ride on an emergency flight to Chicago. Within 12 hours, the story was no longer a contained incident report in an FBI file. It was a raging inferno in the court of public opinion. The tech entrepreneur from Seat 3A, a man named Ben Carter with a substantial social media following, had live tweeted the entire ordeal from the lounge in O'Hare. His posts, filled with righteous indignation, went viral. His first tweet was explosive. On AA 212 SFO JFK, man has severe allergic reaction. Woman W/medical training offers help. A Karen in a blazer physically blocks her and tells her to sit down. That woman? Turns out she's California Attorney General Keisha Sterling. You can't make this stuff up. Hash flying while black. The hashtag was the spark that lit the gasoline. The story was picked up by local Chicago news, then national outlets, then international ones. It was the perfect storm of a story. It had a clear hero, a villain, a life-or-death situation, and a stunning twist of hidden identity. It tapped directly into the raw nerves of race, class, and privilege in America. By the time Keisha landed in New York on a later flight arranged by the governor's office, her face was on every news channel. Reporters ambushed her at the private airfield, shouting questions. She maintained her composure, giving a brief professional statement. My thoughts are with Mr. Alistair and his family, she said, her voice steady. I'm grateful the crew and the Chicago paramedics were able to provide him with the care he needed. The matter is currently under review by the proper authorities, and I will not be commenting further on the details of the incident. She didn't have to. The world was commenting for her. For Caroline Pierce, the nightmare was just beginning. She and Mark were finally released by the FBI in the early hours of the morning, with a stern warning not to leave the state of Illinois without clearance. Their phones were returned, and the moment Caroline powered hers on, it began to melt down. Hundreds of missed calls, thousands of text messages and notifications. Her email inbox was a smoking crater. The board of Ethelred Capital, the CEO, Julian Croft, her colleagues, her clients, and the media. Every major news organization was trying to reach her for a comment. Her name, once a symbol of power and success in the cutthroat world of finance, was now toxic. Her photo, scraped from her company's website, was plastered next to headlines that read, High-flying hate, executive stops AG from saving man's life, and The arrogance of power, the woman who chose privilege over a pulse. Back in New York, the 9-figure merger she was meant to close was already dead. The CEO of the company Ethelred was acquiring had seen the news. He called Julian Croft at Ethelred Capital directly and killed the deal, citing a catastrophic reputational risk associated with the key executive on their team. The reason for killing the deal was leaked to the Wall Street Journal, and Ethelred's stock price began to plummet in pre-market trading. Julian Croft's call finally came through. Caroline answered with a trembling hand. Julian, I can explain. Don't. The CEO's voice was arctic. Don't say a single word, Caroline. Do you have any idea what you've done? You haven't just embarrassed yourself. You've cost this firm hundreds of millions of dollars before the market even opens. You've made us the poster child for corporate evil. It was a misunderstanding, she pleaded, tears now streaming down her face. I didn't know who she was. And that's the problem, isn't it? Julian shot back, his voice raw with fury. It shouldn't matter who she was. She could have been a janitor or a neurosurgeon. A man was dying, and you appointed yourself gatekeeper because you didn't like the look of her. The board met an hour ago. You're fired, Caroline. Effective immediately. Your security access has been revoked. Your corporate accounts are frozen. A courier is on the way to your apartment in New York to collect your company property. We're issuing a public statement in 30 minutes condemning your actions in the strongest possible terms and announcing your termination. Do not contact anyone at this firm again. We're done. The line went dead. Caroline slid to the floor of the bleak hotel room near O'Hare, the phone slipping from her grasp. Fired. It wasn't just a job, it was her entire identity. Her power, her prestige, her 7-figure salary, her place in the world, all of it gone. Erased in a single, brutal phone call. Her husband, Mark, who had been watching with a horrified expression, could only stammer, "What? What do we do?" But Caroline was already spiraling. It wasn't just the job, it was the public shaming. The comment sections online were a cesspool of hatred directed at her. People had found her address, her husband's dental practice, their country club. There were threats. There were calls for boycotts of Mark's business. Her carefully constructed world of privilege and protection had been breached and set ablaze. Meanwhile, a small piece of good news emerged. A spokesperson for Northwestern Memorial Hospital announced that Mr. Gregory Alastair's condition had been stabilized. He was out of immediate danger and was resting in the ICU. The spokesperson specifically thanked the quick action of the flight crew and the Chicago paramedics who met the plane. The Alastair family, however, knew the fuller story. Their eldest son, a lawyer in Chicago, released a statement of his own. Our family would like to extend our deepest, most profound gratitude to Attorney General Keisha Sterling. While we are horrified that her attempts to render life-saving aid were obstructed, we have been told by doctors that her early and accurate diagnosis, relayed to the crew, was critical in guiding the response that ultimately saved our father's life. She is a hero, and the person who stopped her must be held accountable to the fullest extent of the law. The statement was a gut punch to Caroline. Not only had she failed to stop Keisha, but Keisha was now being hailed as a hero. The narrative was set in stone, and she was the villain. The karma wasn't just hitting back, it was using a wrecking ball. She had built her empire on judging others, on calculated risks and brutal assessments of value. And now, the world had judged her and found her worthless. A few weeks passed. The initial media frenzy began to subside, replaced by the relentless grinding machinery of legal and corporate fallout. Caroline Pierce was now a pariah. She and Mark had retreated to their sprawling Connecticut home, essentially hiding from the world. Her termination from Ethelred Capital was old news, but the consequences were still metastasizing. She was unemployable. No firm in finance would touch her. The social circles that once fawned over her now shunned her completely. Her husband's dental practice was suffering, with patients canceling appointments in droves after an activist group organized a boycott. The life she had known was over. For Keisha Sterling, life had returned to a semblance of normalcy, albeit a new, more visible version of it. She was now a reluctant celebrity, recognized everywhere she went. People would stop her in the street to thank her, to shake her hand. She accepted it with grace, but inside she felt no triumph. The incident on the plane had been ugly and traumatic, a stark reminder of the battles she still had to fight, even at her level. The only satisfaction she took was in the news of Mr. Alastair's recovery. He had been released from the hospital and was back home with his family. Keisha had spoken to him and his wife on the phone. A quiet, emotional conversation that had meant more to her than any public accolade. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, her chief of staff, Damian Croft, walked into her office at the California Department of Justice, a thick file in his hand and a strange look on his face. "You're not going to believe this," he said, closing the door behind him. Keisha looked up from a brief she was reading. "What's that, Damian? Remember the Pierce woman from the plane?" "It would be difficult to forget." "Well," Damian said, placing the file on her desk, "it gets worse. or better, depending on your perspective. He tapped the file. This is the preliminary file on the Ethelred Capital investigation. Keisha frowned. I thought our corporate fraud unit was just in the early stages with them. Something about securities manipulation? They were, Damien confirmed. But after the incident on the plane, we got a flood of tips. Anonymous emails, a couple of whistleblowers. It seems Caroline Pierce's very public, very spectacular flameout emboldened some people who were too scared to come forward before. He opened the file. The original investigation was focused on a pattern of insider trading. But the new information, it's a whole different level, Keisha. We're talking about a massive, systematic scheme of corporate sabotage. Keisha leaned forward, her interest piqued. Sabotage? Ethelred has a reputation for hostile takeovers, Damien explained. We always assumed it was just aggressive business. But the whistleblowers are alleging that their strategy is criminal. They identify a target company, then they use shell corporations and third-party contractors to actively sabotage it. They create supply chain disruptions, orchestrate negative PR campaigns, poach key employees with fake offers, even initiate frivolous lawsuits to drain the target's resources. Once the company's stock is in the toilet and they're on the verge of bankruptcy, Ethelred swoops in and buys them for pennies on the dollar. Keisha's eyes widened. That's not just hostile, that's racketeering. Exactly. It's a criminal enterprise hiding in plain sight as a private equity firm. And guess who was the architect and lead executioner of this entire strategy? Keisha looked down at the file, though she already knew the answer. Caroline Pierce. She ran the entire division, Damien said, his voice low. She personally signed off on these operations. The whistleblowers have provided internal memos, encrypted emails, payment records to the contractors they used for the sabotage. It's a treasure trove, Keisha. Enough to build a RICO case that could dismantle the entire firm and send its senior leadership to prison for a very long time. Keisha sat back in her chair, a slow, cold realization washing over her. The incident on the plane had done more than just ruin one woman's career. Caroline's act of public hubris had inadvertently shone a spotlight so bright on her and her company that it illuminated crimes far deeper and more insidious than anyone had suspected. Her arrogance in that moment hadn't just been a personal failing. It was a symptom of the same corrupt, entitled mindset that allowed her to destroy other companies for profit without a second thought. The irony, Keisha murmured, is staggering. It gets better, Damien said, a grim smile on his face. Guess what the big merger was that she was flying to New York to close? The one that fell apart because of her? The very same. The target company was a clean energy startup in California, one that your office has been championing, Solara Innovations. They've been struggling for the last year with a series of inexplicable setbacks. A key shipment of rare earth minerals from a supplier went missing. Their lead engineer was poached by a mysterious, well-funded competitor that vanished after he quit. Their stock had cratered. They were on the brink of collapse, and Ethelred was the white knight coming in to buy them out. Keisha stared at him, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Ethelred was the one sabotaging them all along, and Caroline Pierce was flying to New York to personally oversee the final kill, Damien finished. If she hadn't been so vile to you on that plane, Solara Innovations would have been consumed by now, and Ethelred would have buried their technology or sold it off for parts. All that evidence would have remained hidden. Keisha stood up and walked to the large window overlooking the city. She felt a chill run down her spine. This was no longer just about the karma of a single event. It was about a much larger, more complex web of justice. Her personal humiliation on that flight had, through a bizarre twist of fate, become the catalyst for exposing a massive criminal conspiracy. By trying to stop her from saving one man's life, Caroline Pierce had inadvertently saved an entire company and triggered an investigation that could bring down an empire of corruption. "Get the head of the corporate fraud unit in my office," Keisha said, her voice now filled with the cold, hard resolve of the Attorney General. "And get a team to reach out to the U.S. Attorney's Office. This has interstate implications. We're going to need a joint task force." She turned back from the window, her expression grim. It seems Miss Pierce is about to find out what real interference with federal and state interests looks like. The investigation into Ethelred Capital moved with astonishing speed. Armed with the whistleblower testimonies and Caroline Pierce's own panicked digital footprint, the Joint Task Force of the California DOJ and the FBI built their case with ruthless efficiency. They obtained sealed warrants and conducted a series of coordinated pre-dawn raids on Ethelred's offices in New York and San Francisco, as well as the homes of its senior executives. For Caroline, the moment of reckoning came not as a phone call, but as a battering ram. At 6 a.m. on a crisp autumn morning, a team of FBI agents smashed through the ornate front door of her Connecticut mansion. She and Mark were woken by the splintering of wood and the shouts of "FBI, warrants, hands where I can see them." She stumbled out of her bedroom in a silk robe to find a dozen agents in tactical gear spreading through her home. An agent presented her with a warrant thick enough to be a novel. The charges were listed in cold, black ink: racketeering, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, securities fraud, interstate transportation of stolen property. It was a list so long and so serious that the incident on the plane seemed like a trivial prelude. She was arrested. The images were stark and brutal, captured by the news crews that had mysteriously been tipped off to the raid. Caroline Pierce, the once untouchable queen of finance, was led from her mansion in handcuffs, her face pale and terrified, wearing a rumpled robe and slippers. There was no designer blazer to hide behind now, no shield of wealth or privilege that could stop the inexorable march of justice. Her husband, Mark, was also detained for questioning regarding his potential knowledge of and benefit from his wife's illicit earnings. His dental practice was effectively shuttered, pending the investigation. The CEO, Julian Croft, and two other senior partners at Ethelred were arrested in similar raids. The financial world was thunderstruck. Ethelred Capital, once a titan of industry, collapsed overnight. Its assets were frozen, its reputation incinerated. The story dominated the news cycle for weeks, a sprawling epic of corporate greed and corruption. And at the center of every story was the bizarre karmic origin, an act of casual cruelty on an airplane. News analysts drew a direct line from Caroline's sneering dismissal of Keisha Sterling to the complete annihilation of her life and her company. It was a morality tale for the modern age, a story so perfect in its symmetry that it felt scripted. Keisha Sterling watched it all unfold from a professional distance. She recused herself from direct oversight of the prosecution to avoid any appearance of a conflict of interest or personal vendetta, handing the reins to her most trusted deputy. But she was kept informed. She read the reports, saw the evidence, and understood the sheer scale of the crimes Caroline and her colleagues had committed. There was no joy in it. Seeing Caroline's downfall brought her no pleasure. Instead, she felt a profound sense of melancholy. Caroline Pierce was not some uniquely evil monster. She was a product of a system that rewarded ruthless ambition and dehumanized the opposition. The same entitled mindset that led her to dismiss a black woman in a tracksuit was what allowed her to gut companies and ruin lives without a second thought. They were two sides of the same corrupt coin. The legal process ground on. Faced with a mountain of evidence and the testimony of multiple former employees who had been granted immunity, the Ethelred executives began to turn on each other. Julian Croft, in a bid to save himself, provided prosecutors with a detailed roadmap of the entire racketeering scheme, implicating Caroline as the primary architect and operational leader. Caroline, abandoned by her allies and facing decades in federal prison, grew increasingly desperate. Her high-priced lawyers advised her that her only chance was a plea deal, but her ego, the very thing that had caused her downfall, couldn't accept it. She was Caroline Pierce. She didn't plead. Months later, desperate and running out of options, she did something truly audacious. Through a back-channel contact, a former law school classmate who now worked in the California government, she requested a meeting, not with the prosecutors, but with Keisha Sterling herself. The request landed on Damian Croft's desk. He brought it to Keisha with a look of disbelief. "She wants to see you," he said. "Her lawyer is framing it as an attempt to personally apologize and appeal to your sense of decency. before her trial. It's a flagrant attempt at witness tampering and prosecutorial intimidation, Keisha said, her voice flat. Of course it is, Damien agreed. It's insane. We should obviously refuse. Keisha was silent for a long moment, looking out her window. The city sprawled below, a complex ecosystem of ambition, struggle, and consequence. Refusing was the smart, safe, legally sound thing to do, but something compelled her. This story had started with the two of them, face to face in a pressurized cabin. Perhaps it needed to end that way too. No, she said finally, turning back to Damien. I'll see her, set it up, in my office, with you and a department counsel present as witnesses, and record it, all of it. Damien stared at her. Keisha, are you sure? What could possibly be the point? The point, Keisha said, her voice quiet but firm, is that this woman still believes she can manipulate her way out of consequences. She still believes her status gives her special access, a different set of rules. I want her to look me in the eye, in this office, surrounded by the power she so badly misjudged, and understand, once and for all, that the rules apply to her. It was a risk, a calculated one. But Keisha Sterling had always been good at calculating risks. She was about to give Caroline Pierce the face-to-face meeting she wanted. It would not be the one Caroline was expecting. The day of the meeting, the air in the Attorney General's office was heavy with anticipation. The sprawling corner office, with its panoramic views of the Sacramento skyline, was a testament to institutional power. Law books lined the walls, and the state and national flags stood sentinel behind a large, imposing oak desk. Keisha Sterling stood by the window, not in a tracksuit, but in a sharply tailored navy blue suit. She was the Attorney General in full. Damien Croft and a senior department counsel, a stoic man named Robert Coleman, sat quietly on a leather sofa, their notebooks ready. A small, discreet camera in the corner of the room was recording. Caroline Pierce was escorted in by a building security guard. The woman who entered was a ghost of her former self. The immaculate blonde bob was gone, replaced by dull, unkempt hair. She was thin, her expensive but ill-fitting clothes hanging off her frame. The fire of arrogance in her eyes had been extinguished, replaced by the hollowed-out desperation of a cornered animal. She clutched a designer handbag like a shield, a relic from a life that no longer existed. Her eyes scanned the room and landed on Keisha. For a moment she seemed to lose her breath, seeing the woman from the plane standing in this seat of immense power. The cognitive dissonance was still a shock to her system. "Miss Pierce?" Keisha said, her voice neutral. She did not move from the window. "Thank you for coming. You requested this meeting." Caroline swallowed hard, her gaze darting from Keisha to the two men on the sofa and back again. This wasn't the private, intimate appeal she had envisioned. This was a formal proceeding. "Attorney General Sterling," she began, her voice hoarse. "Keisha, I wanted to come here today to apologize, sincerely." Keisha remained silent, her expression unreadable, letting Caroline speak into the void. "What happened on that plane was inexcusable," Caroline continued, her words stumbling over each other. "I was stressed, I was arrogant, I was wrong. I was a horrible person that day, and I am so sorry for what I said to you, for what I did, for putting Mr. Alastair's life in danger." She took a hesitant step forward. "I know that my apology doesn't change anything, but I am not the monster the media has made me out to be. I made a terrible mistake, a moment of awful judgment, and my life has been destroyed because of it. My career, my reputation, my husband's practice, everything is gone." Tears began to well in her eyes. This was the performance she had rehearsed, the contrite, broken woman begging for mercy. "I know that your office is prosecuting my case," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And I know that you recused yourself, but you still have influence. People listen to you. I am begging you, please, tell them to stop. Tell them I've been punished enough. I've lost everything. A long prison sentence, and it won't serve any purpose. It would be a vendetta. There it was, the real reason for the meeting, the appeal wrapped in an apology. Keisha finally turned fully from the window and walked slowly toward her desk, sitting down in her high-backed leather chair. She folded her hands, the picture of calm authority. "Miss Pierce," she said, her voice cutting through the woman's self-pity, "let's be very clear about what is happening here. You did not come here to apologize to me. You came here to use me. You are here because you still believe, even now, that you can leverage a personal connection to circumvent the justice system. You still believe the rules can be bent for you." Caroline flinched as if struck. "No, that's not true, isn't it?" Keisha interrupted, her voice hardening. "You speak of your moment of awful judgment on the plane, but the investigation, the one you triggered with your behavior, has revealed that your actions on that flight were not a momentary lapse. They were a perfect illustration of your character." She leaned forward. "The same arrogance that allowed you to look at me and see something less than human, something unworthy of respect, is the exact same arrogance that allowed you to systematically destroy companies for profit. The same callous disregard you showed for Mr. Allister's life is the same disregard you showed for the thousands of employees whose livelihoods you wiped out. You didn't just have one bad moment, Miss Pierce. You built a life, a career, an empire on a foundation of them." Keisha gestured around the office. "You think your punishment is about me? About what happened at 35,000 feet? That incident was merely the catalyst. It was the loose thread that, when pulled, unraveled the entire corrupt tapestry of your professional life. Your current legal troubles are not a vendetta. They are a direct consequence of a decade of criminal activity. The evidence is overwhelming. The testimony of the people you worked with is damning. You are not being prosecuted for being rude to me on an airplane. You are being prosecuted for being a racketeer." Caroline stood frozen, her face ashen. The last of her hope, her last desperate gambit, was being systematically dismantled. "You say you've lost everything," Keisha continued, her voice softening slightly but losing none of its steel. "And perhaps you have. But Mr. Allister almost lost his life. The employees of Solara Innovations almost lost their futures. Justice is not about what is best for you, Miss Pierce. It is about accountability for the harm you have caused to others. My influence, as you call it, will not be used to stop this process. It will be used to ensure that it is fair, thorough, and that justice is served. For everyone you victimized." She stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "Thank you for your time. The security guard will show you out." Caroline Pierce stared at her, her mouth agape. There was nothing left to say, no angle left to play. She was utterly, completely defeated. She turned, a broken woman, and walked out of the office without another word. As the door closed, Damien let out a long, low whistle. "Well," he said, "that was intense." Keisha remained standing, looking at the closed door. She felt no victory, only a grim, weary finality. The wheels of justice would now turn, grinding slowly but surely. Caroline Pierce would face a jury, and she would almost certainly spend years behind bars. A fate she had sealed for herself, not in a boardroom but in the aisle of an airplane, with a single contemptuous look and a few fatal words. Keisha turned back to her desk, the weight of her office settling back onto her shoulders, and got back to work. So, what can we take away from the dramatic rise and catastrophic fall of Caroline Pierce? This story serves as a powerful, real-world reminder that our true character isn't revealed when we're on a stage, but when we think no one of consequence is watching. A single act of prejudice, born from a lifetime of unchecked privilege, set off a chain reaction that karma itself couldn't have scripted better. It shows us that power isn't just about a title or a bank account. True power lies in integrity, compassion, and the quiet dignity with which we treat our fellow human beings. Caroline Pierce misjudged a person, and in doing so, brought judgment upon her entire world. Justice, in this case, wasn't just blind, it was poetic. If this story of karmic justice resonated with you, Please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell for more incredible true-life dramas where consequences catch up with those who believe they are above them. What did you think of Keisha's final words to Caroline? Let us know in the comments below.